Hello everybody, I'm Mark Weisgerber, as you may or may not know by now. And for the last semester I've been working on this concept and studying vertical ecologies, working on symbiotic relationships with an axometric design. The nice part about how I started with this for a little history class was originally with research methods. I started looking at sustainable rating systems. As a sustainable concentration major, I figured, okay, well there's got to be exciting possibilities and opportunities with this. And the nice part is that there are many, many different rating systems, and none of them go together very well, and they're very difficult to compare and contrast. So at the last minute, I decided to go with sustainable skyscrapers. Wrote the paper because there was too many variations with the rating systems, and had a lot of fun and started discovering some very interesting and exciting opportunities, especially relating to sustainability. The nice part is, in starting this thesis, Ed ended up pointing me towards Ela Berman's Sustainable Skyscrapers development that she had with some of her honors kids out in San Francisco. And the nice part was it started the discussion of what is a vertical ecology, as they had actually used network relationships and ecosystems to actually start looking at sustainability from an entirely different point of view, which was using interior relationships to extend life cycle. In this case, although they had a lot of good starts to this, especially in terms of pushing conventions, a lot of it was actually railing against modernism and focusing on parametric design. Unfortunately, they did not extend it as much as it needed to be done. So from there, taking this initial findings, I started asking a lot of questions. What is a vertical ecology? What is its purpose? How do we start making these things, make them more efficient? What's the objective overall? Where do they work best? So a lot of these questions actually drove the remainder of the research. So from there, I started looking at some just overall concepts that are going on in skyscrapers right now. And there's a lot of concern about the typology, especially in terms of security and safety. But then even more recently has been this development that maybe LEED doesn't necessarily make a sustainable skyscraper though. It's an intriguing concept based off of the Harmon Tower, in which they made a sustainable skyscraper, which is, we've discussed several times, a vacant structure which will never be inhabited. They're likely to tear it down and destroy it. And does that make a sustainable skyscraper? As well, three forces in particular, suburbanization, digitalization, and globalization, have combined in the last 30 years to make us basically reconsider the typology as a whole, let alone its relationship to sustainability. But what's the hope from this overall thesis goal? The Jetsons, the happier lifestyle, everything's easier, but then more importantly, that these buildings perhaps can become self-sufficient in times of crisis and of danger, but then as well during economic lulls, so that we can actually have something that starts making these buildings last longer and push through these lulls in the cycle. But the current reality is that the sustainable skyscraper is a paradox. Though it's incredibly based on performance, it doesn't necessarily guarantee an extended life cycle. And over time, we've actually had oscillations within these skyscrapers. Sometimes we've built more of them, sometimes less. But the overall trend is that we're making more of them. If we're going to make more of them, and we're trying to decrease energy use or make these things more efficient, in what ways can we start to do so? And especially with the increase of telecommunications, what role does the skyscraper have in a world where you can actually work from home? So to start with, I looked at the historical oscillations. Ended up stumbling onto the fact that there are 5, soon to be 6, specific energy generations of skyscrapers, all occurring with specific relationships to technology. And my approach to this was to look at how, over time, the skyscraper and its relationships, interior relationships, actually drove skyscraper evolution. Does it? And what I ended up discovering was that, much as it's shown on the previous slide, while there's economic oscillations that occur that make more or less skyscrapers and impact design, overall there's been other oscillations that directly relate to interior function. So in the beginning, skyscrapers were created as a result of technological forces, the elevator, better engineering systems. But it was part of this period of unknowable urbanism where for the first time, we were able to build some incredibly tall, incredibly massive, and anything could fit or go within it. So the forces of economics had a great impact on the first generation of the skyscrapers. It was primarily categorized by a single use, the business classification, that ended up inhabiting this incredible volume of space. Not only were they the ones that could afford the inner city costs that came with exponential increase of price, but as well they were the ones that could physically fill some of these spaces. The large amount of clerical workers that were needed to run businesses kept going up exponentially. And this pushed the typology in a certain direction and certain design. The second energy generation came from regulation and increasing size and scope of the buildings. As these things kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, they necessarily started having greater amounts of diversity that were needed even just to break even. So we started seeing a variety of different users, from entertainment, such as theaters, and for the first time the public actually started using these buildings and being incorporated. So you started seeing the rise of observation towers. So for the first time, rather than the top of these buildings just being mechanical systems, they suddenly had a role for the public involvement, which led to these different concepts of identity. But this also started pushing skyscrapers into a different direction. In the 1950s, with the development of HVAC, the third generation was born. Now this was characterized by post-war growth of big business, and as well had a direct relationship with the rise of the automobile. And this pushed the typology back towards a single-use categorization. Now this mode lasted for the next 30 years until digitalization, globalization started creating different ways in which we could actually access and use our urban environments. So as cities started decreasing in population, people ended up seeing different opportunities and ways that they could actually use these structures. I mean, you could actually start not only living at them and commuting to work across the globe, but you could actually start using them more energy efficiently. And this also started pushing skyscrapers in a different role. Now over time, this oscillation that we've had, not only for interior program, has gone up and down, but it's been directly affecting towards energy generation as well. The first generation of skyscrapers only had to generate enough electricity to heat the building and to have vertical mobility. The second generation, due to the formal setbacks from the 1916 zoning in New York, made a less energy efficient building overall. The original form, which was just a square site plan, repeated several times, is far more energy efficient because it has less envelope exposure and ways that energy can actually leave the building. But they also started having greater increases in technology. The third generation, HVAC, made them even more energy inefficient as you started having incredible demands that came for not only heating and cooling the building, but then in terms of accessing it and communicating. This worked they kept getting more and more inefficient through the 1970s, evolving even in terms of design, where Mies van der Rohe started pushing this concept of a black box skyscraper, so even increasing the thermal and heating loads on these structures. Until the 1973 oil crisis, when you started actually having a re-examination of energy generation. Immediately, the results were a decrease in lumens that were required, which had been exponentially increasing, up until 1996, when you started seeing high-performance skyscrapers that started paying attention to even more reducing the energy loads. So we started to see an oscillation back, or down from this energy generation high. Now the question that we have is, where do we go from next? We've had these 5 different periods, but do we go back towards a single-use categorization, or do we actually push it up, push the biodiversity, push it to something else? Are we right on the brink of the 6th generation of skyscrapers? Now all of this brings up additional questions. Who has used this? I mean, over time it's shifted, but we need to start looking at more of a contemporary approach. Who uses the skyscraper impact it? How does transit relate to these different functions? Does lead factor into this at all? And to start looking at what a vertical ecology is, I needed to start seeking some specific definitions. So my thoughts for what a vertical ecology should be are as a symbiotic relationships, more diversity, Skyscrapers currently can accommodate a variety of different uses and actually are more diverse than they ever have been, but how can we increase that? Using programmatic design to actually drive the next generation of skyscrapers and using networks to impact the structure. So the second literature review that I ended up really focusing on was a thesis by Tom Lee from Harvard, where he actually had started to also question what a vertical ecology is, but how to design it. So in his approach, he ended up taking relationships that we understand very well, in this case a horizontal network from a neighborhood that he lived in, and then rotating at 90 degrees, hoping to seek if the current relationships that we understand very well horizontal can translate vertical. And unfortunately, they do not. Once you rotate, let's say, the streetscape 90 degrees, the whole concept of public and private introverts. Now, to access the building, you have to go inside of it. So the public street space that we would see in a neighborhood becomes the vertical movement, the elevators, the stairs that are inside of the building, which are not that public at all. And the opposite is true, that when you arrive at your destination, the private space, your backyard, will be removed from the streetscape. It would not be as easily seen by the public. But in a skyscraper, that is the outside of the building. That is the place that people naturally see the most. So to further study what a vertical ecology could be, we started looking at different case studies and grouped them into two separate parts. The first is based on performance, looking at concepts of lead, structural envelope, and then using ecology can actually affect it. And unfortunately, this had many problems. A lot of these buildings are used as marketing gimmicks. Many of them aren't even located in urban areas that this would necessarily work. They're still primarily based for single users. However, they've also had a lot of successes. They're far more energy efficient than they ever have been, and just by their very iconic stature, they challenge our natural conventions. The second case study is closer to this concept of vertical ecologies, using programmatic design to actually push the uses of the building on the inside. But this also has problems. A lot of these buildings don't relate their interior functions well. They separate them and segregate them too much. There's a heavy focus on elevators rather than on any other types of movement within inside of it. And also in terms of being a vertical ecologies, only one example, the CCTV tower, comes close in terms of using different interior functions, but it's a direct relationship more to its political system than it is to economic realities. We can only create something like the CCTV tower currently in a communist system which is a heavy top-down approach. All the other examples, from our historical Pan Am building to our contemporary Shanghai tower, have still just stacked, repetitive stacks of single typology use and then broken this occasionally. In the Pan Am case, it works very well as a mobility hub, but does not directly relate to the skyscraper above it. But the last, on the far right, this concept of boulevard skyscraper, which is a theoretical approach from Volo, starts to actually seek what we would like to do with sustainable skyscrapers in the future, using a different connections approach. In this case, he created a skyscraper in Paris and used the boulevard to start connecting some of these spaces. Now, this problem was that in terms of starting at the top of the building and working your way down, you could permeate the structure very well. But if you were to go up these ramps, it would be very tiresome after a considerable amount of point in time. But the nice part is that each one of these programmatic design, from the sixth generation of skyscrapers, has had a lot of success. Many of them are very energy efficient, many of them are very iconic, and many of them start using transit in ways that we've never thought of before. The next part is we started looking at where vertical ecologies might work best. And I went from one extreme to another. So on the left, urban environment, and on the right, the suburban environment. Now, where should we locate these? Well, in breaking down each environment, we started looking at the fact that urban ecologies require a lot of diversity, a lot of density to start to sustain them. And though contemporary skyscrapers work very well in a suburban setting, as they're very segregated, very reliant on single modes of transit, let's say, and cater to a specific type of users, the vertical ecology would lend itself better towards an urban environment, not only in terms of who can access and use the building, But if we were to have public space as part of the overall design, the public space in an urban realm is far more relished. And as well, the identity that you would have would be even greater so. Though suburban skyscrapers carry their own set of identities, they necessarily relate the realm in which they're situated, the suburban concept. So using a public urban skyscraper to push identity has far more opportunities. Now, who can go inside of these buildings? Now, currently, as I've mentioned, skyscrapers are more diverse than they ever have been, yet they still primarily remain office environments, when the ability that they have to incorporate any limitless number of users still remains. So I started breaking down some of the prior slides' images of users into groupings based on similarities. In case of pass-through, you have pedestrians, tourists, commuters, people that would just normally pass through the building and wouldn't have an extended amount of time. And utilizing 7 different categories and started looking at relationships between the two. I was hoping to use relationships to actually start pushing this concept of vertical ecological design. Now this brings up even more questions. Where does the energy come from, in an urban skyscraper? How do we keep these things secure? The impact of politics, transit, yet again. To start looking at the next generation of skyscrapers, I first looked at how to design these things. In the past, we've had this concept of a section or a plan as the generator of this skyscraper, and it's worked very, very well. Skyscrapers were considered machines of efficiency, where they would just naturally repeat site conditions and were less vacant than not because of very specific economic forces. But this has shifted over time. They're not adequate for programmatic interior design because all they end up doing in terms of spatial relationships is take spaces that we understand and relate very well in one dimension and then repeat them as many times as necessary to be economically profitable. But to create a true vertical ecology, we need to start thinking about how to create them or generate them differently. And axiometric design offers exciting possibilities. Currently, architects are designing very well in 3 dimensions because of the computer. However, we're still primarily a 2-dimensional field. We cannot, even though we can conceive of spaces in 3D, we still rely on the pen and the paper to actually convey these ideas. And axonometric design takes the concept of the section and or plan as the generator and then turns it into an isometric. So we can take these same space planning concepts that we understand very well, but then situate them within the skyscraper completely different and start focusing on how relationships between these spaces start creating the overall design. So overall, this offers incredible exciting opportunities for the 6th generation of the skyscraper. Now these connections that would link these different relationships then become incredibly important. In this case, we have 3 that exist in various forms of success, and then we understand them very well, the slow, the medium, the fast, using stairs and escalators to access different parts very slowly and express elevators to get to the top much quicker. But unfortunately, for vertical ecologies to work, the medium way to almost quickly move through the building yet still see things and not be hindered by unaccess becomes more important. And currently, stairs and or airport walkways are more of the approach that we conventionally see, but we need to start thinking about this perhaps a little different. Now the neat part is that some people have come up with different ideas of how to move in 3 dimensions, how to start creating symbiotic relationships through movement. And though some of these are necessarily science fiction, they start actually addressing some of these questions. So in the case of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, having a space that can move in 3 dimensions and start to link. Elevator shaft that actually expands and contracts to connect spaces but not be limited by the elevator. And in conclusion, I come up with even more questions as to the next phase of where we go with the vertical ecology. Though we're starting to see an understanding of relationships, we're not necessarily sure how it looks. How do we start filling in some of these spaces? What is it still? Other purposes that we can have. And then how to create successful relationships. Just because we can identify certain relationships now does not necessarily mean that in the future these same relationships will exist. And how do we create cohesion in an urban environment, if that is our place to select? There's a difference between a downtown, a midtown, an uptown, and each one of these can be studied more in depth. So the next part that we will start to focus on will be through design. And I'd like to thank you kindly for your time.
Thank you kindly for your presentation.
There we go.
Oh, I can jump back, obviously, in the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Or we shall, I guess.
Oh, thanks, Mark. It was very well presented, very clear regarding your position, your current state of your thesis. I think it was provocative. I think it was, your thoughts are well organized, but it leaves me with even more questions than the questions you left yourself with. I guess a couple of questions. What is your working definition of ecology?
Yep. I would say that biodiversity seems to be, all these different terms, relationships and networks and ecologies. I've been using them interchangeably throughout this whole thesis project, and I know we've had several discussions now. Okay, what does this mean? Refine it, explain it better. And in terms of rough understanding of ecologies, I would say that it's network relationships that are symbiotic, that help build on one another rather than tear each other down.
Symbiotic network relationships.
Thank you, Mark Taylor.
Then I have to know what symbiotic means as a working definition, what network is as a working definition, what relationships are. I think the textbook definition of ecology is just the relationship between organism and environment. And if you're talking about vertical ecologies, then I want to know how verticality alters the relationship between organism and environment. So what specific environment are we talking about? What specific organisms are we talking about? And I'd like to see you respond to this over the course of the spring semester as a way of focusing your ideas and thinking and passion. Because I think if it remains quite vague and general, if it is always about symbiotic network relationships, I have no idea ultimately what that means in relationship to a tall building. So I would encourage you, my personal comment would be to encourage you to define vertical ecologies as specifically as you can in an effort to respond to some of the questions that you have. And by respond, I don't mean you're giving us an answer or solution that we'll judge, but you need to have an articulate response to the questions, not just pose the question.
Correct.
And there's no great risk of responding to the questions that your thesis brings up. They're challenging questions. Not many people have been able to respond to